So, this is actually, in terms of being produced, not the first video done this way. And in many ways, I could be jumping the gun. But in terms of release, this is going to be the first video done this way. This is the capture of Trimcomalee. And instead of me talking about this using XSplit and recording using XSplit, which has been my traditional, nay, my constant companion for the last few years, today I am using OBS. Why? Because I reached the point with XSplit that I was honestly starting to consider versions of violence to its creators. I pay for the version of XSplit, which is supposed to be the professional version, okay? I didn't skimp out. I looked at the price and went, that's not that much considering the amount of time I use it over a year, and it's the better version. It's supposed to be makes sense, and it's supposed to be better, it's supposed to be more helpful, all these things. And I thought, well, that's a sensible thing to do. Trouble is, it doesn't work that well. It keeps having issues. So I've tried to do some recording with some keyship videos using OBS. They seem to work out when I uploaded them. And so you are getting the first 2 minutes of this video, I do apologize, have been about the fact that this is going to be recorded using OBS. I hope it works well. I hope you like it. I hope my head hasn't become supersized. Potentially. But it's all there. So, this is about a fight in the Revolutionary Wars. This is a fight which is often forgotten because for quite a long time, Britain did not control Ceylon, as it was called, Sri Lanka as it is today. As such, Britain was not the only major Western power with major holdings in the Indian Ocean. The French would, of course, claim Martinique, but let's be honest, the French control of Martinique is always a kind of interesting thing, as they would also probably claim Madagascar. All those islands, I think it's Madagascar, Martinique's in the West Indies, in it. Too much discussing the various West Indies and East. Apologies. But they would, of course, claim Madagascar. But Madagascar is off to one side. Madagascar sits off the coast of Africa. It's not really in the Indian Ocean as it is part of the Indian Ocean. You cannot get more in the Indian Ocean than Ceylon, Sri Lanka. You just can't. And the Dutch had run it for years, centuries. We're used to thinking about the Dutch East Indies as being this critically important part of the Dutch economy. Well, Ceylon was that times 10. It was absolutely essential. It was big plantations, it was thriving cities, it was their economic hub of their empire, through which they funneled their trade. And the British took it off them. The British, who had been their allies traditionally at this point. Although, they'd actually done it before. It wasn't even the first time they took Trimcomalee. It just wasn't. They'd done that before and we'll be talking about that. Shameless book plug. Always nice to put in a shameless book plug. what can I say? I still do love that book. And by the way, there is a softback edition. The second edition that's coming out is soft. So it's going to be in hard and soft, the second edition. And it's coming out in 30th of October, I think. Yes, 30th of October. It's going to be released. That's the current release date. I say current release date because I did have the great and joyous phone call for anyone who is their first book. The publisher rings you up and goes, yeah, there's been so much demand for your book, we're releasing it early. You are? We are. Oh, goody. So, if you want a softback edition, I'm told with the same cover, I'm told it looks just as fantabulous. It's coming on the 30th of October. And I'm not egotistical over it at all. I'm just rather looking forward to the fact that should mean I hopefully have a paycheck in January come through from it to go towards my tax bill. The joys of being an adult. You can never enjoy anything. Ah, well. It's fun. So, the capture of Trimcomalee in 1782. That's the thing. I skipped and then it does it auto-skipping, whether I've doesn't. That is the one thing I would say of OBS. It's not quite the same when it comes to dealing with skipping. Now, the Fourth Anglo-Dutch War was... It was a nightmare, really, for the Dutch. It really was. They had to depend on the French coming in and saving them. That was not a good feeling for them. If it hadn't been for Pierre-André de Suffren, aka the Admiral, coming and retaking and basically turning up with a lot of troops and a lot of ships and retaking Trimcomalee, they could have lost it in 1782. They could have lost it in 1782. As it is, they lost it roughly 13 years later. But, you know, they had 13 years more. It also, how do I put this politely, shows the issues for the Dutch in this era. When they had set themselves up in, and I'm going to use Ceylon to describe it because from now on, because I hope you do realise I'm referring to modern day Sri Lanka. Ceylon was the historical term, and all the sources are in Ceylon, so it just makes sense to keep referring to it that way. Rather than keep going, Ceylon, Sri Lanka. That just sounds like I'm trying to add in extra words to me. So, the thing is, they had been able to control Ceylon whilst they were a major power. And they were a major power. There have been discussions since I did the benchmark Navy video about whether or not they were also a global power or the major global power before Britain. Spain and Portugal. And what really makes a global power. The thing is, you're talking about the ability to project not just force that can overwhelm, and let's face it, in terms of military technology, that is the area I'm discussing at this point before I agitate too many keyboard warriors, and I'm going to be agitating a few enough today. Military technology were not as advanced as the European forces who were coming out to them. Basically, Europe benefited from a very lucky in terms of resources period, but also a lot of conflict. And that enabled them to build an empire. But the thing about being a global power is you also have to be able to defend that empire. And that's the problem for the Dutch. They lose this one and lose Ceylon and it gets taken by the French. Well, recaptured by the French and returned to them. And this was the Fourth Anglo-Dutch War. The Fourth Anglo-Dutch War was, unsurprisingly, part of the American Revolutionary Wars, or all the wars around that period. So yes, it was when everyone decided to pile on Britain. And the fact is, the Dutch joined in the piling on Britain, and they still lost territory and had to get it recaptured by other larger powers. That's not a good look. That doesn't speak of strength. Now, to be fair, this is partially down to the Dutch system, which is very fair, but also has a lot of issues in terms of falling into a quagmire. They can very quickly become into a malaise of, well, petty squabbles, which most democracies, even modern democracies, are prey to. But time went on, the Dutch actually allied with the British in the French Revolutionary Wars. They allied with them. Why? Because revolutionary France was considered a bigger threat to the Netherlands than it was to Britain, actually. And so they joined the First Coalition. They lost. There were sufficient Dutch radicals who didn't like the stadtholder, the Orange family, and, well, they combined with a French army and pushed them out. The trouble is, the French Revolutionary Wars are vicious, nasty, and lots of people get involved in them. But for the minor powers involved, i.e. those who are not Britain or France, you tend to get really crushed up. You have these two steamrollers and you're just hanging on. There are other powers who will claim they are just as important. The Prussians, they're really important. But they can't really argue the British because the British pay their bills. The Russians, they're important. They're a great power. Few small issues. Just a few small issues with that. Austrians get mauled too often. And again, every single time the coalitions get beaten up, it's Britain which has to reassemble them. Usually using British money. And the more that takes place, the more problems you get for the smaller powers. The more the war becomes Britain and France deciding who's going to be leading the world, the less and less you matter. And so, this comes us to the story of the Batavian Republic. When it's formed, it has a lot of ideas, a lot of good ideas, but one of the permanent millstones it has upon its back is that it's required to pay the wages of a 25,000 strong French army of occupation. Oh no, I'm sorry, French army of assistance and protection. Combine that with the fact that the moment they are involved, they are part of the naval war against Britain, which means all their trade, all their movement of goods, all the things that earn them money is now able to be preyed upon by the British privateers and by the Royal Navy. That's not good. Now, Now, with the Dutch, we often just talk about a couple of battles. We talk about the Battle of Camperdown, which, of course, is won by Admiral Duncan. I was going to say Admiral Cunningham at that point. Admiral Duncan. And that's a pretty famous victory. But there's also the Battle of Blanknes and Grisnes, which were these engagements where Karel Hendrik Verheul is getting ships through from the Netherlands to the coast of France in preparation for Napoleon's planned invasion of Britain. And he actually successfully does it. He gets the ships through. This is something which the British are really trying to stop, but he gets them through. How? And by the way, this takes place in 1805. How does he get them through? Well, and I'll point out the small thing. By hugging the coast so closely and going so close to ensure that they have support from artillery forts and land-based artillery, and the British do not want to come in that close. It's moves like that which are why Camperdown, despite my personal view of it being just as high risk and just as dangerous as Trafalgar, in fact, arguably more so, because the Dutch, if they'd won, there are far less fleets between them and London, and that would have been absolutely disastrous in that period if they'd managed to repeat anything like the Chatham raid. Well, in this case, those ships are getting to the north coast of France. If the fleets of Trafalgar had managed to get through past Nelson's fleet, the fleet hanging around in the Bay of Biscay, and the other squadron being positioned in the Channel, to actually in a position where they could cover the attack, it would have been very, very dangerous. It's good that Nelson wins at Trafalgar because it stops it all coming together and keeps it a very nice long safe distance away from the UK. But the reason it's so scary for them in terms of Trafalgar, the reason those fleets are so scary is because of the work of Karel Hendrik Verheul, who's been getting ships to northern France to actually carry out the invasion. Now, the Indian Ocean itself, wow. How best to describe the East Indies theatre in the French Revolutionary Wars? It's a nightmare. There are all sorts of interesting operations carried out, but basically, the British spend most of the period doing what they call the Batvian campaigns, which involves taking Ceylon, taking Cape Colony, and also Saldanha Bay, which is another pretty critical colony, and they also decide to head off towards Java as well. The French keep trying, and it's interesting to note that the British do not really do more than blockade the key French positions. Why? Because they're trying to do the maximum they can in the East Indies with the minimum amount of resources from home. This is why vessels like the Sibylle and the Prudent are taking on vessels like the Centurion and the Diomede. The Centurion is, of course, a fourth rate. I've done a whole video about those. Fourth rates turning up are rare, but Centurion comes along and does all sorts of interesting things. The Battle of Ile-Ronde is... oof. It's a nasty little battle, but it's pretty much a stalemate. The French go back in afterwards, and they don't come out again. And this leaves Reyna, Commander-in-Chief East Indies, this gentleman, to do pretty much what he likes. One of the things you should note is that he is Commander-in-Chief East Indies, but then also Sir George Keith Eccleston comes out as well, and also theoretically has the role. pretty much what the reason Eccleston comes out is Eccleston's coming out to carry on operations which Rayner has started, and Rayner is taking some of the ships which Eccleston brings with him, as in new ships, and some of his own his previous ships with him, to go and carry out Java and other operations. So basically, one's a consolidation commander, one's the attacking commander, and the British work it out by just going, yes, you're both vice admirals, but one of you's of the blue and the other one's of the red. There you go. That solves it. And you're both have the status of commander in chief of the East Indies as far as your own squadrons are concerned. These ships are your squadron. These ships are your squadrons. And by the way, Rayner, you're the senior one, but pretty much you and Eccleston are going to be so distant from each other that it doesn't matter. And also it doesn't really matter because the real command structure in the Far East is not really the British government. It is, but it isn't. Because at this period, we're talking Robert Hobart, 4th Earl of Buckinghamshire, Governor of Madras, senior British governor in India. This is not quite the British Raj era where the governor of India is pretty much, as far as you can be concerned, the British government in the Far East. Diplomacy, everything runs through the governor of India to the extent that, frankly, they tell the government what they're doing. They are that senior. It's not quite that level, but it is at the level at which, due to the distance in terms of government action, they trust Robert Hobart. They trust him implicitly. And you can see from his political career, he's a Member of Parliament on several occasions, for Portlandton, Armagh, Bramber, Lincoln. He's Chief Secretary of Ireland, Leader of the House of Lords, Secretary of State for War and the Colonies, 1801 to 1804, Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, but in 1805 and 1812, and President of the Board of Control, 1812 to 1816. He is a safe pair of hands. He's not considered to be going for anything senior. He doesn't need to go for senior. He becomes the Earl of Buckinghamshire. And he's the governor of Madras at this point. And he's important to our scenario because the moment he hears there's war, he turns around to Rayner and goes, "Can you take Ceylon?" And Rayner goes, "I need troops." At which point he turns around to his senior general, Major General James Stewart, who is this gentleman, and goes, "Get every single soldier you can grab." This is one of the reasons why there is some honest dispute about which regiments take part. Okay? When I give a list of troops taking part in the British operations, I'm giving a list of the regiments which are solidly there from the beginning. There are others which turn up for the longer campaign. There are others for which there are companies or platoons which seem to be involved. They are loaded as extra supplements to the Marines. Some of the ships, it's just... how do I put this politely? The British strip everything out of the colonies they can from India to take with them. And they do this rapidly. So rapidly that this poor gentleman, if I skip forward to him, Johan van Angelbeek, who is a very committed, very hard-working, very diligent Dutch, I would say, administrator more than anything else. He is a governor. He he has certain duties in terms of being a theoretically military governor as well at points and commanding and controlling his forces. But that's because he has so few forces there. He honestly doesn't have the senior officers he's supposed to have. He doesn't have the team he's supposed to have. And he is a very experienced officer. He's been in post as governor of Dutch India from 1787 to 1794. He's the governor of Ceylon from 1794 to 1796. During the entire invasion, he is focusing on running Ceylon, on trying to get it to survive. He fails. One of the reasons he fails is the Dutch colony really doesn't have the forces. This is the initial force the British dispatch. More arrive. And more arrive. They sent 3 regiments of foot. The 1st and 23rd Battalions of Madras Native Infantry, detachments of the Royal Artillery and Madras Artillery, and logistical auxiliary forces. Pretty much, you're looking at the East India Company is going to war. That is what you're talking about in those formations. They might not have EIC after them, but they are funded and supported by the EIC. When you talk about Suffolk, Centurion, Diomede, Hermione, again, it's the EIC infrastructure. And the logistical auxiliary forces, this is a key part. They do an amphibious campaign. And I mean a pure textbook amphibious campaign. They are dancing around the Dutch. The Dutch are going, we have the interior lines of communication. Yay! We can't beat the British. They keep getting there first. How? Well, they're dancing around us in their ships. And there's nothing we can do about it. And historically, what had happened? Historically, the French had come and saved them. The French had come and helped them. This time, the French couldn't come. That's a problem for the Dutch. They aren't able to send the sufficient force to dislodge the British. The British are able to replace and rebuild themselves faster. And this is another thing to point out with the British strategy when it comes to the Revolutionary Wars. People often go, oh, Britain has a historically small army. It does. It doesn't have the large armies that Prussia and France traditionally have. It has them. But what it does do is it also doesn't deploy its army as one lump. It has its army all over the world, doing nasty operations. Because let's be honest, if you're taking off the islands and the colonies from these other powers, if you're stripping the Dutch of the infrastructure and the economic vibrancy they need to sustain themselves as an independent power, and you're their ally, you know this better than anyone. You know exactly how much their economy depended upon those places. It's going to be support for you. Now, I'm going to quickly skip back to here, and I'm going to start talking through the invasion, because this goes through every 3 minutes. It doesn't... I don't have it... I think if I'm going to use OBS permanently, I need to set it up with a Steam Deck, so that I can control things without having to keep doing a lot of mouse movements and a lot of selections. I think. But, back to the invasion. Now, once Hobart had got everything in full order. And he doesn't even wait for orders from home. Please note, he hears there's war declared, he starts his planning and sends them off. He sends a notification to the British government telling what he's doing after he's launching it. Which is why the supplies arrive when they do, because basically the British government get a note going, we are invading here, here, and here. Okay. Please send supplies. Well, we either send supplies or we lose, in which case we lose face, and we also lose a chance of winning all that potential. Okay, you lot, you were going where? You're not going there anymore. No, don't worry. You're going off to the East Indies. Yes. You hear there's a lot of tropical diseases there. Don't worry. We don't care if you live. Carry on. Go off. Sorry. Did I get too much into the government of the 18th century then at that point? Fun times. So, the 71st, well, they're a Highland Regiment. The 72nd, Highland Regiment, and the 73rd are a Highland Regiment. All three were Highland Regiments. So you're basically sending 3 Highland Regiments to local regiments as your core force to go under this invasion. You're sending tough troops. And the native Madras troops were also famed for being pretty darn hardy. Now, the initial force is supported by Suffolk and Centurion. The next force, which comes from India, which is organised from India, is escorted by Diarmid and Heron. Pretty much, Stuart and Rainier both fought and hoped, pardon me, that Van Engelbeek will allow a peaceful occupation. They had letters from William of Orange, which advocated cooperation with British forces, and those have been sent out with notes that the Latvian Republic was now at war with Britain. And a Major Agnew is sent ashore at Colombo to try and persuade Van Engelbeek. The idea being that if it was actually not an invasion, if it was just the British landing troops to protect it from French occupation, and they turn it over to the Dutch government of William of Orange. Unfortunately, during the 2 days of attempts made to discuss these things and work these things out, Diarmid, that lovely vessel, managed to sink herself on an uncharted rock. All the crew, all the passengers were saved, but of course military stores are lost with the frigate. So what happens? They give the invasion the go-ahead. The troops land about 4 nautical miles, or 7.5 kilometres north of Trimcomalee, unopposed. Typical British landing. We don't land at the point at which we're going to get resistance. We land away from it and then walk towards it, and advanced through the terrain towards Trimcomalee. Due to the fact that the sea was being the sea, i.e. heavy surf, high winds, it took from the 3rd August to 13th August to complete the disembarkation. And so it wasn't until the 18th of August that they began the emplacements approaching Trimcomalee. The thing that doesn't seem to have noticed to the British at this point was that the Latvian garrison makes no effort to oppose or impede the advances of British forces, and the reason is because there are so few of them. By the 23rd, there are 8 18-pounder long guns and some more smaller guns borrowed from Suffolk in various firing positions around Trimcomalee, and they open a heavy fusillade. On the 24th, which creates a breach in the walls. Following the traditional practice at the time, they both make preparations for an assault and make very obvious preparations for assault, but also send a message to the fort's commander demanding his surrender. There was a little bit of negotiation. Not as much as you might think there should be, but there was a negotiation. And the garrison of less than 700 troops were taken prisoner, and the 100 cannon was seized. British losses amounted to 16 killed and 60 wounded. Fort Oestenburg, which was a nearby fort which was also held by Batavia forces, was forced to surrender on the 31st of August to the British under the same terms as Trimcomalee. And at this point, the Batvian trading posts and all the other positions around the Ceylon coastline start to surrender in very quick succession. At this point, we have the 22nd Regiment of Foot and the 52nd Regiment of Foot starts to join in. The 52nd Regiment of Foot is specifically mentioned HMS Hobart, which was an 18-gun sloop, which turns up at certain points in this campaign. I think perhaps the detachment of troops from that were aboard her might well have been her replacement instead of Marines. It's similar to the 22nd Regiment of Foot. They are turning up and wandering around. Now, in September of that year, and we are talking about 1795, Rainier takes most of his ships eastward to operate against other territories, specifically aiming for Jakarta, formerly what was known at that time as Batavia in Java, and leaves the command of the blockade of Colombo, etc., under the command and supporting operations under command of Captain Alan Garner. In January 1796, Elphinstone arrives, and he detaches Stately, HMS Stately and HMS Arrogant, which are quite nice ships, let's be honest. Stately's a 64-gunner, and Arrogant's a 74-gunner, so two third rates to assist Garner with what he's doing. And it's at this point that the British start building up for what it will be the final push. And the final push involves them bringing up not just the ships which the Royal Navy has given them, but HMS Rattlesnake, Echo, Swift, and 5 East India Company ships. General Stewart comes again with more troops. He left for a period to go and do other operations, but he returns. And well, their aim is for Colombo, which was the last major holdout. And that was where Van Angelbeek was. They managed to disembark at Negombo, a Dutch fort, which had been... Let's put it this way. Usually the phrase is abandoned, but honestly had never been fully crewed, fully filled up with all the personnel which it should have had. So yes, the previous year the garrison had thought, this ain't really a safe place to be. And so they land there on 5th of February 1796. They march overland to Colombo, and they arrive on Valentine's Day, the 14th of February. The garrison is issued a demand requiring their surrender, or expect immediate assault. The defences were in that bad a condition, they thought that they, with storming parties ready, being prepared, forlorn hopes, the full thing, they could take it straight away. And it seems to be Van Angleby agrees with them, because on the 15th of February, he goes, I surrender. There's no point in fighting. From this point onwards, the British have now secured complete presence in the Indian Ocean. Taking the Cape Colony, taking Ceylon, these allow them to control access to the Indian Ocean and allow them to control movement in the Indian Ocean. Their fleet now has a lot more support than anyone else in some of the best harbours in the area. Trimcomalee Harbour is absolutely amazing for fleet use. Absolutely amazing. In whatever period you are. Look at how big it is and look at how defensible it is. It's great. You can get up to all sorts of things in there, nice and safely. This is one of the problems, though, I would argue, for the British. Because the more they take over their global empire, the more they build up their global empire, the more the only big risks, only nations which are actually able to hurt them, are back in the Atlantic, in the Mediterranean. They start concentrating forces there because those are the only threats which are really threats. Everything else, they've got a well-practiced methodology of dealing with it. They cut them off from their home country, and then they swallow them up. It's an economic boost to Britain, but it is also the beginning of issues. Because it starts to, it really doesn't really start, but it does put a seal on the methodology of making it seem like the obvious one for Britain to apply. Especially after the Treaty of Amiens pretty much agreed that all this was belonging to the British before the Batvian Republic were even consulted. That's the very thing. The French give this away without even bothering to consult the Dutch. They just don't matter as far as they're concerned for negotiations. Don't matter at all. So, question. And this is a British Empire question. But it's a question which is probably a sensible one to ask if you're considering future evolutions of humanity into space or things like that. The British Empire's expansion was thanks to fortuitous infrastructure acquisition or required infrastructure investment. Discuss. i.e., did they manage to get the right places early on, which gave them the infrastructure they needed to do the expanding? Or did they, when they got the places, invest in them, so they had the infrastructure to do the expanding later? Probably producing the infrastructure for a completely different reason other than the actual expansion. Be really interested to hear what you say. So what have we got coming up? Well, we have the story of land ships. which I'm probably going to re-record on OBS after this, because this seems to have gone a lot better, and OBS seems to be happier doing it than XSplit at the moment. XSplit's, I hope it works well later. I really hope it does. And then we have Winning a War, Holzendorf, and Unrestricted Submarine Warfare. Ooh, that's going to be a fun one. Take care, thank you very much for watching, and I hope you're having a nice time. Oh, I can expand this outside the screen. I'm going to have to remember that.